Europe, and our members, Générations Futures from France, Global 2000 from Austria, Pan Germany, and Pan Netherlands. My name is Martin Dermien. I am the director of Pan Europe. For us, it is a little bit special to announce this court case time-wise, because no later than 3 days ago, an American jury condemned Bayer to pay $1.5 billion following proofs that the company is very well aware of the toxicity and in particular carcinogenicity of glyphosate and glyphosate-based herbicides. While we in the EU have politicians who decided to reapprove the substance. Could my colleagues please display the presentation? So we will have a joint presentation that will last a bit less than half an hour. And then there will be 3 breakout rooms, an English one, a French one, and a German one. So next slide, please. I will start by reminding you briefly that the EU Commission proposed a reapproval of glyphosate for another 10 years. There was a first vote in the so-called Standing Committee on Plant, Animal, Food and Feed in October. There was no qualified majority to support the Commission proposal to reapprove glyphosate. So there was a second vote last Thursday in the Appeal Committee, where again, no qualified majority supported the Commission, and even this time Italy abstained, meaning that only 42% of the represented Europeans voted in favor of the reapproval, and directly the European Commission announced a reapproval of the substance, saying that they are obliged to do so, but for us it is very clear that the law requires them not to do so. So since the end of 2021, there was a modification of the ARUS regulation, giving NGOs access to EU court on EU approval of pesticides. So Pan Europe, as well as our member Générations Futures, we already have challenged a series of active substances in court, and now we will use this another time this right to challenge the reapproval of glyphosate. Next slide, please. So the process is that first we need to have the Commission to publish in the EU official journal the reapproval of glyphosate. This should take place, we expected, by the beginning of December. Next, and then we have 8 weeks to send what is called a request for internal review to the European Commission, where we set all our legal and scientific arguments for the case. We cannot include new arguments further. We have 8 weeks, and then the Commission has 22 weeks to reply to our request for internal review. We then have 8 weeks, again, a much shorter period of time, to apply for annulment before the General Court of the EU. And in this procedure, there can be interveners, which we expect to be numerous in this case, considering the interest of many private stakeholders for glyphosate. We are curious to see if we will have more member states or more pesticide companies who will intervene, and there can be other entities like trade companies and so on. And on the other side, we can next also have member states or NGOs intervening to support our case and also ask for an annulment of the Commission decision. Next, and then after a quite long procedure, we will have where we will have exchange of pleas, of arguments. We will receive certainly questions from the court. There will be a hearing, which is public, and we will invite you to come to the hearing because it's also very interesting to see how the Commission presents itself in court. And finally, there will be a judgment that is expected in 2026. So all in all, next, the procedure lasts at least 2 years, and as it will be a bit more complicated case with more interveners and so on, we expect it will be more than 2 years. Next slide. Next, so we will go to court based on a misimplementation by the Commission and Member States of EU law on pesticide approvals. This regulation next is very well written. It gives a high level of protection to human health. It is underpinned by the precautionary principle with very strict data requirements, strict approval criteria. And the assessment must be in line with the current state of the scientific and technical knowledge. Next. Very important to us also is the case law that has been built over the last years, mostly by NGOs, but also by other stakeholders, where the EU court very clearly said that health and the environment take precedence over industry interests. The EU court defined very precisely what is the precautionary principle, where they say that even if the risk is very small and we are not sure it will happen, member states and the Commission have to take action to protect citizens. Clearly, it is not the case here. There is also the EU court also reminded the obligation of testing cocktail effects of pesticides, and in the glyphosate case, in the reapproval dossier, there is one representative formulation, which is glyphosate bioflow, that was not tested for its long-term toxicity. And very worryingly, last week, the renowned Ramazzini Institute published a study showing that when you feed rats with concentrations, doses of glyphosate and in particular this representative formulation at doses that are supposedly harmless to humans, rats develop leukemia in a significant way. There is also the obligation to include the most up-to-date scientific science and give them as much weight as industry studies. And we will see later that EFSA and the Commission are doing exactly the opposite to what the EU court said. Next. So now I will pass on to my colleagues who will tell you a little bit more in detail our main lines of argumentation for this court case. So now I give the floor to my colleague Pauline from Générations Futures.
Yes, thank you, Martin. So I'm Pauline Servant from Générations Futures, and I will present you the fact that independent literature is not taken into account in the dossier. So I'm sure you've already heard the comment that the assessment of glyphosate is the most comprehensive ever carried out. There is thousands of pages, thousands of studies evaluated, etc. This is highly misleading because the fact that studies are mentioned in the dossier does not mean that they have been taken into account. So we have identified the main reasons why almost academic studies were excluded. First, hundreds of studies are judged non-relevant or not useful for the regulatory assessment for wrong reasons. In particularly, mechanistic studies, including studies on oxidative stress and or mitochondrial toxicity, were considered as non-relevant for the assessment. Also, other studies carried out with formulation used outside Europe were excluded. And then there are some effects that are not assessed at all. For example, the effect on the microbiome. The reason, according to the RAR, is that the investigation of gut microbiota is currently not part of the European assessment framework for pesticides. So all the studies were not considered further for the assessment. Overall, more of 1,000 studies identified, only 211 are judged relevant and useful for the regulatory assessment. And then over these 11 studies, relevant and useful, only 30 have been considered as fully reliable. So because no academic studies was used as case study for the derivation of safety levels. So the system for, next slide, please. The system for assessing the quality of studies that exclude almost all independent studies is for us not compliant with the pesticide regulation, and in particular with Article 8.5 and the Annex 2 of the regulation, which both say that to include literature studies in the assessment. The assessment performed in the dossier also does not comply with EFSA's own recommendation. For instance, regarding mechanistic studies, the EFSA guidance says that they may be useful for the interpretation of other studies present in the dossier, and they would be relevant. And however, all mechanistic studies were not taken into account. So this exclusion of the majority of literature studies is one of the main reasons for the difference between the conclusion between the regulatory assessment and the scientific. And it is for us the biggest, one of the biggest failure of this dossier.
Thank you very much, Pauline. Now I will give the floor to our colleague Peter Klausing from PAN Germany to discuss carcinogenicity. Next slide, please. Thanks.
So let me start with the official requirements for assessing carcinogenicity in the European Union, because this will help to understand how much the authorities deviated from their own rules, something which needs, I think, to be brought up to the court case. As you can see here, category 1B, which would require a ban of the pesticide, is given when there is a significant increase of malignant tumors in at least 2 independent studies. Category 2 requires an increased tumor incidence in 1 study only. Please remember that the European authorities concluded that there is no evidence at all for carcinogenic effects of glyphosate. Next slide, please. Here is a summary of the results of the 5 mouse studies considered valid by the European authorities. And as you can see, there is no study without a significant increase in tumors. Even worse, the same tumor type was observed in multiple studies. You may wonder how the European authorities made these tumors disappear to enable their conclusion that glyphosate is not carcinogenic. It is good scientific practice to use additional evidence to avoid that a coincidental tumor increase is wrongly interpreted as a substance-related event. However, there are rules how to use these additional evidence properly. And there is proof that the European authorities twisted and abused these rules to claim that glyphosate is not carcinogenic. I will be happy to answer questions in this regard. And in my last slide, I would like to show you how strong the evidence, for instance, is for kidney tumors. As mentioned before, the basic requirements are to have at least 2 studies with a significantly increased tumor rate. Here we have 3 out of 5. As for the additional evidence, dose dependence is a strong criterion, and it was observed in 2 of the 3 studies. In other words, the kidney tumors were observed more frequently in the highest dose group. Most importantly, since 2019, we know a mechanism explaining how glyphosate can cause kidney tumors in mice. These 2 aspects alone make it highly improbable that the observed increase in tumors of kidneys was by coincidence. These 2 criteria were neglected by the European authorities, and at the same time, other criteria like the appropriate statistical method, the so-called limit dose, and historical control data were twisted to facilitate the dismissal of the tumor findings. And that's my contribution to the carcinogenicity assessment of the European authorities.
Thank you very much, Peter. Now the floor is to our colleague Helmut Burtscher-Schaden from Global 2000 Austria.
Thanks, Martin. Good morning. I will briefly discuss another potential health risk from glyphosate, the assessment of which, in our opinion, was not in line with EU legislation. The evidence on developmental neurotoxicity, in short, DNT. Central to this is a study on DNT, which was conducted already 2 decades ago by industry itself, more precisely a study by one of the 5 glyphosate salts that has been on the market at that time and is not on the market now, the so-called trimesium salt of glyphosate. However, as you probably know, industry never has submitted this study to the EFSA, contrary to legal requirements, and this despite, or maybe even because, the results were very concerning. Offspring of rats exposed to comparatively low concentrations of glyphosate trimesium during gestation showed significant and dose-dependent increase in neurological impairment. EFSA was informed about this special study by third-party scientists. Nevertheless, these worrying results had no influence on EFSA's risk assessment. EFSA only identified data gaps. And this is the only slide today from my side. You can read in the review report, a data gap is set to identify whether the DNT findings reported in the studies with glyphosate trimesium are due to glyphosate. What does that mean? EFSA acknowledges the obvious. We cannot be sure whether the harmful behavioral effects observed in rat offspring were caused by glyphosate or only by trimesium salt or even a combination of both. Crucially, however, if these adverse effects are attributable to glyphosate, which is at least plausible, then this would have major consequences and would completely overturn the whole risk assessment, because the adverse effects occurred in this study at doses much lower than any adverse effect observed in any other industry study with glyphosate deemed reliable by EFSA. And this would impact the most important health-based guidance value of the whole risk assessment, the so-called No Observed Adverse Effect Level, NOAEL, which is routinely derived from the study with the lowest dose that shows adverse effects. In this case, the NOAEL would simply be wrong, and with it, the values that are crucial for setting maximum residual levels of glyphosate in food, or for setting the acceptable exposure level for people that work with glyphosate or residents in rural areas. The approval of glyphosate under such circumstances is a high-risk gamble. If the trimesium ion was causal for the DNT effect, then lucky. But if it was glyphosate, then the safe levels derived from the risk assessment by EFSA are not safe levels, but 5 times higher than the safe levels you get when you consider the DNT effect. And the consequence of all that is human health is put at risk, while industry is rewarded for the unlawful withholding of an unfavorable study. We believe this provides a strong basis for taking the matter to the European Court to demonstrate that the assessment of glyphosate is, among other things, in violation of the precautionary principle enshrined in European law. Thanks.
Thank you, Helmut. Now the floor is to my colleague Angeliki Lesimaku.
Thank you, Martin. Good morning, everyone. So I will speak about the fact that the impacts on microbiome, biodiversity, and soil health have been dismissed. As we heard before, the pesticide EU law is very specific on this and says that pesticides that they are approved should have no impact to human health and the environment, and that includes biodiversity and ecosystems. So we know that glyphosate kills all plants, from herbs to trees, but something that is not as well known is that it's also toxic to microorganisms such as fungi and bacteria. And in fact, it has been patented as an antibiotic. So if we take this into account, it's maybe not surprising that glyphosate also has an impact on human microbiome. And it affects the population of certain organisms, giving rise to those that they are more pathogenic and can lead to inflammation. Now we know, because based on research science that has developed a lot the recent years, we know that such alterations on the human microbiome can lead to serious chronic diseases. And this is also the case for other species. Now, the microorganisms, they also have they are really important for healthy soils. Therefore, we've seen that glyphosate can change the communities in the soil, and change the biodiversity in the soil. And therefore, it can interfere with the absorption of nutrients from the plants, making them more vulnerable to disease. And it can also, and it can also give rise to pathogenic organisms in the soil. So it's actually not even good for the future of farming. When we look at the scientific literature on impacts to the environment, we find hundreds of studies that show that glyphosate and glyphosate products are toxic to a wide range of organisms, from aquatic species to insects to frogs and small mammals. We know, actually, based on the industry studies, that glyphosate is toxic to aquatic organisms. It causes chronic toxicity, but scientific literature shows that this is actually an underestimation to what extent is toxic. And we also know that interferes, it kills all plants, but being also toxic to other organisms, it has an impact on biodiversity and ecosystems. Now, it's interesting that EFSA in its peer review recognizes that glyphosate has an impact on the microbiome of humans and other species, but also on a wide range of organisms in the environment, as well as biodiversity. However, it says that in the lack of harmonized guidelines, we know that these guidelines take years to develop. So if they say they cannot conclude on the seriousness of these effects, which is simply not true. As we heard, that it's nowhere, EFSA has to use the most recent science, and it's nowhere in the EU law or the EFSA guideline that says that they need to have a harmonized protocol, guidelines to conclude on whether there is an impact or not. They can simply base the conclusion on what's in the scientific literature. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Angeliki. So we're reaching the end of this press conference. Next slide, please. So as a conclusion, in our view, the reapproval is a political decision that is not based on EU law. It is opposed to EU law and also to the scientific evidence on the toxicity of glyphosate, as well as also evidence we have from litigations in the US. Next, it's also completely opposed to what EU population is asking. As a reminder, there was this 2017 ECI Stop Glyphosate that was the most successful ECI ever, with 1.3 million signatures collected in around 6 months. It was a very, very quick ECI, as well as the results of a very recent Ipsos poll that we have conducted with some of our members. Next, showing that all over Europe, you have, as you can see here in red, the opposition to the reapproval in 6 EU countries, And in green, the support to the reapproval. And overall, the support is only 14%, while the opposition is 62%, with a very high, much higher opposition in certain countries like France or Germany. With that, I would like to thank you for your participation.